Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, and it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. I mean, you need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Thursday broadcast. Obviously, you guys are watching the Thursday night matchup between the Arizona Cardinals and the Seattle Seahawks. Obviously, the Seattle Seahawks are one of the teams leading the NFC West. We're going to be discussing about the midway point about the NFL season during this Cameron Parker Show. But we also are going to be discussing, we're going to take a little bit of a beat on Major League Baseball. We're going to take a little bit of a beat on the NFL because, well, there was a trade that went down between the Colorado Avalanche and the Ottawa Senators that sent Matt Duchene, the forward/center of the Colorado Avalanche, and he was shipped off to the Ottawa Senators. And we're going to get the insight from a hockey buff himself, a guy that I know that I worked with, had the pleasure of working. He has tremendous insight as far as the NHL is concerned, and we are going to speak with him here shortly and talk about the Matt Duchene deal, talk about potentially who won that trade, and, well, in particular, the comments that was ringing in as far as Eric Johnson is concerned, the comments that said that, well, that he really didn't want to be here, talking about Matt Duchene, talk about the impact, certainly, that could do for a locker room, the impact that could do for the team, and who is likely to step up now with the absence of Matt Duchene. Well, we're going to talk about that with Sean Tafoya. Sean Tafoya will be coming on here in just a little bit. But again, we're going to be talking about also the Denver Broncos. So even though we're taking a little bit of a beat on it, talking about the Denver Broncos, we are going to be talking about the NHL. And joining us on the broadcast is none other than Sean Tafoya. How you doing, my man?
Great. How are you, Cam?
Doing good. So, real quick, Sean Tafoya is a MSBN announcer, or should I say broadcaster, play-by-play, color commentator for MSN, Metro State Broadcast Network. I had the pleasure for working with them for a period of time, but real briefly, for the people, because this is a podcast that was post what was on the Metro State campus, but tell everybody what the Metro State Broadcast Network is, and if people...
So the Metro State Broadcast Network basically was and is a production via the athletics department of MSU Denver, where we covered basically every single varsity sport, from volleyball, men's, women's soccer, men's, women's basketball, softball, baseball, pretty much everything under the MSU Denver sphere of the athletics department. We did online broadcasts of all that, and feature stories, and a couple TV shows as well from the Metro State from MSU Denver Athletics, and that was pretty much what entailed in the Metro State Broadcast Network.
Awesome. And
that's explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And now obviously, you are actually are broadcasting a game tonight, or were you broadcasting a game tomorrow?
Tomorrow and Saturday. So right now I'm in Rochester. I got a little freelance gig on my own accord. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath. I was running back to my hotel room to make it here on time. But so I'm covering the Division III National Junior College Athletic Association volleyball championships here in Rochester, Minnesota. So I must say it's very cold, and I thought my ears were going to fall off on my way home. So
I hear you. You know, it's incredible, those kind of gigs that really do fly under the radar. I had the opportunity of doing the Colorado Crossroads in March, talking about the volleyball tournament that, you know, is for people that are like 13 to 17 or 18 that are, you know, in that age group. And it's just an experience that you just never forget, because of the fact that you really, because I think the one thing for me, and we'll talk about the Avalanche here in just a little bit, but the one thing for me that I really gleaned a lot from, as far as being a part of Metro's broadcast team for KMET Radio or for MSBN, was you really do respect a lot of those sports that really do fly under the radar, you know, such as like volleyball.
Right. Volleyball, I think, kind of crazy too, is because I'm just graduated up here. Just trying to find some gigs to keep myself busy until hopefully, you know, something comes about. But I mean, volleyball, you talk about a sport that I knew absolutely nothing about probably 2.5, 3 years ago, and you probably might be able to, you know, share in this sentiment with me of just not really knowing, you know, anything about volleyball, but then working for Metro, covering, you know, such a team like Metro with, you know, their 2 All-American players on it is just, you know, an invaluable experience. And then, you know, one of my first paid gigs is coming out here to cover volleyball, you know, so.
It really is. It's such a valuable experience. It really is. You know, when you think about, especially for me, I never really had the opportunity to call women's softball before. And, you know, obviously being kind of a baseball aficionado, you still maybe learn the ins and outs sometimes of softball versus baseball, but there are still a lot of intricacies as far as softball is concerned that you really don't really pick up unless you are ingrained and are studying it and so on and so forth. But, yeah. Go ahead.
Absolutely agree.
Now it is kind of funny, and like I said, we'll go into the Avalanche, but it's kind of funny how you kind of got your start and kind of weaved your way in. If I remember right, I think we were in a class together for Richard Ortner's class.
Yeah, on-air broadcasting.
On-air broadcasting, and
That's
we
right.
had and it was so funny that is legitimately what kicked you off as far as being involved with MyMet Media.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty cool to see both you and Kermit Ball.
I just saw Kermit this weekend too at RMAC Championship Women's Soccer over at Regis. Did a little video work for the RMAC this weekend, and Kermit was there.
Okay, little corner kick reunion.
Games, so it was kind of cool to see Kermit. Kind of a throwback to, I guess, my start in this whole field and net media just in general, and just I guess media in general, you know.
Yeah, it was a corner kick reunion, which was your first show.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into it.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into it. You know, the Colorado Avalanche. I haven't had a lot of time, especially talking about the Colorado Avalanche. But there was a massive trade that went down.
Mm-hmm.
I went and probably saw his last moments at the Pepsi Center. Certainly his last moments of the Pepsi Center when I went to the Nuggets game, and he just so happened to be courtside. But as far as the trade, it felt like it was a trade that was honestly and I don't watch a whole lot of Avalanche games. However, I was an outsider looking in. You certainly got the sense that this was a trade that was going to happen probably. It felt that way in the last 2 years, that this trade was about to go down.
Yeah, so really, if you haven't been following this closely, Matt Duchene has pretty much not wanted to be a member of the Colorado Avalanche for really quite some time now. And it came out after the trade happened and Ottawa went out and acquired him, that he actually formally requested a trade. They were kind of shopping his name before that, but Matt Duchene formally requested a trade last December at around Christmas time. So if you think about that saga, formally for Matt Duchene, it came from last Christmas all the way until it came into a headway into early mid-March to when he actually got traded. So kind of a really long saga, I guess. And if you watch his parting interview, if you will, I mean, at that point, the Islanders-Avalanche game didn't really matter. It was all about Matt Duchene, and he was completely surrounded by media. But he said that, it's been a long couple of years. So this has been a trade, and this has kind of been a saga with Matt Duchene that has played out for quite some time now.
Well, let's start off with the obvious question. Who won the trade?
Who won the trade?
I guess it's really kind of a hindsight is 2020 because we really don't know that answer until
Right.
2 or 3 years down the road or a year down the road. But hindsight 2020, who won the trade?
So, in the short term, I think so I'm going to throw a little short term, long term at you. In the very short term, the Ottawa Senators basically won that trade because they went and I guess kind of traded away a couple of key pieces in Kamenev, who was one of their top centering prospects. Maybe not a prospect, but a very highly touted prospect. And then they traded away Bowers as well, who was their first round draft pick in the last draft just this past year. And then you trade away Hammond as well, which is basically just to fill goaltending depth for the Avalanche, which is all he was for the Senators. But in exchange, you get Matt Duchene, a center with, X amount of ceiling that he never really lived up to with the Colorado Avalanche, but he has a chance to do that with the Ottawa Senators. So what the Ottawa Senators have acquired is perhaps a number one center for a team that, you talk about, I guess, kind of flying under the radar. When a lot of people think Ottawa Senators, they don't really think Cup contenders. But Cam, you're talking about a team that went to the Eastern Conference Finals last year and took a very good Pittsburgh Penguins team to 7 games. So in the short term, I think the Ottawa Senators won the trade. I think the Nashville Predators got the, worst of it. But Kyle Turris is a player that I think really fits with their system, plays a really good two-way game, which is kind of what the Predators are kind of known for, that gritty, defensive mantra. And then if you think about the Avs in the long term, I think the Avs are going to end up winning this trade. You have Steven Gerrard, who's already with the team in Sweden right now. I had to think where they were for their global series. He's already with the team. He's probably going to play tomorrow or Saturday already for the team. There's reports that Joe Sakic has already said that Kamenev would be with the team, but he was facing some visa issues. So he said as soon as they get back to Colorado, he's probably coming up to the big club, and he said that he's a big part of what they want to do here. So you get a A-plus defensive prospect for all intents and purposes, league-wide. You think that he's NHL ready right now, and he's going to slot into the Avalanche. What they're doing right now is they got rid of a lot of deadweight and a lot of veteran guys that were maybe over the hill, and they're going to start giving these younger guys a chance, and Gerrard is one of those guys. And then Kamenev is just a great, big, strong two-way center So he'll play probably on the second or third line, slot in right away into the lineup for the Avalanche. And then Bowers, a left winger, obviously a first-round draft pick with a high upside. And he should be ready to go in a couple of years, hopefully, if everything goes right for the Avalanche. Hammond is just an icing on the cake to fill some goaltending depth, and it's been well documented that goaltending depth is a very important part of the NHL, especially with what you've seen from Las Vegas. They've lost 3 or 4 goalies, and they're on their wits' end here. And then on top of that, you also get a first, second, and third round pick in next year's draft. So the Avalanche have really set themselves up for success moving forward with a good young core with already players like Kerfoot and McKinnon and Rantanen and Nikita Zadorov already on the team, and all those guys are already going to be stepping into their own within the next couple of years. So in the long term, I think the Avalanche are going to be the winners of this trade. But in the short term, the Sens have set themselves up to compete this year before their proverbial window closes, if you will.
So let's go into the comments. You certainly got the sense that it was a pretty severed locker room with Matt Duchene there. I mean, not often are you going to get a public forum with an athlete or with a player, NHL, Major League Baseball, NFL, probably more so than any of them, but very rarely will you get a public forum where a player will publicly say that someone didn't want to be here. And obviously, defenseman Eric Johnson came out during, or it was actually after the game, and he was talking about Matt Duchene, and very bluntly, he said he didn't want to be here. Does this help or hurt a locker room, just in general?
What, Matt Duchene?
I'm just saying.
What he had this year. Now the fact that he's gone.
Now that the fact that he's gone.
I think it'll help. It'll help the Avalanche because it wasn't just Eric Johnson, and obviously Eric Johnson is a big part of that locker room and what he brings to the table as far as leadership. He's one of those guys that wears the A, was a former first overall draft pick, has been with the team for quite some time and has been leading this defensive core for quite some time for the Avalanche. But you also had Gabriel Landeskog, a guy that's played with Duchene for, a number of years and is the captain of this team, also hinting at the fact that Matt Duchene didn't want to be there. But from everything that I've read and everything that I've heard, I think that Matt Duchene's departure helps the Avalanche because for the last year and a half, 2 years, you have this cloud of Matt Duchene in the locker room. Does he want to be here? Does he not want to be here? Is he going to get traded? When is he going to get traded? What are we going to get back from? What's going on with Matt Duchene? And it's just this cloud that's been hanging over the Avalanche's head. So they ship him out. They get, 2 really good young players that can help the team right off the bat. Lots of draft picks. Future's looking bright. And I think that it just, relieves a little bit off of the Colorado Avalanche's shoulders. You don't have to worry about Matt Duchene. You don't have to worry about, is he going to be here tomorrow? You can just go back and you can get back to hockey. Right now, we're about a month into the season. The Avalanche are in position to make the playoffs right now. I know we're still young. It's still really early, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Avalanche don't make the playoffs. But you've definitely seen improvements with how the roster is starting to unfold. And, we went through the package, and to get a package like that for a guy like Matt Duchene, who really skilled hockey player, but has never eclipsed more than 70 points in his entire career, is just absolutely phenomenal. Joe Sakic has to be excited. The team has to be excited. And really, if you're an Avalanche fan, you have to be excited about that trade, no matter how sentimental you are about Matt Duchene. So it absolutely helps the Colorado Avalanche.
Final question before we go to a different topic, because I know that you've been wanting to come on the Camp Progress Show for quite some time and talk multiple sports. But final question, who is a player, if you were to pinpoint one player in general, that could really benefit from now having Matt Duchene off the lineup? Who would be one player that could benefit the most?
Alexander Kerfoot, I think, would be the player for me. I mean, you can talk about, I guess, the mindset of the bigger players. Like McKinnon, maybe this is his team now more than it was ever Matt Duchene's. I mean, same can be said for Gabriel Landeskog. But Alexander Kerfoot, when, the Avalanche broke for camp, he was a prospect that probably, for all intents and purposes, wasn't going to make the Colorado Avalanche. Had a great camp, though, had a great preseason, and ended up making the team out of camp and was on the opening night roster. Now he's been slated into that second-line role, and for the majority of the season, he's been playing with Duchene and Nail Yakupov. But now he kind of gets to step into that role that Duchene was there. Duchene's role is probably now his role. So he has an opportunity to showcase his talents and show that he is not only an elite prospect in the Av system and in the NHL, but he's also well on his way to becoming an elite player. So Alexander Kerfoot, I think, is one player to look out for the Colorado Avalanche now that Matt Duchene's gone. And it's kind of funny because there was reports today that he had to be rushed to the emergency room because he had an allergic reaction to peanuts today. So kind of a scary situation for Alexander Kerfoot. But he's gotten off to a hot start for the Colorado Avalanche. Give me a second here. Let me just pull up the stats from his season so far. But he's been absolutely magnificent. Everything and more that you would want from a young forward stepping into his very first season in the NHL. We kind of already know what you're going to get out of Sven, Andrighetto, McKinnon, and that Rantanen line, but we weren't really sure what that second line was going to I guess, come about for the Colorado Avalanche. But it's been wonderful to watch, and the Avs are really a team that can go out and they can roll four lines and just throw high quality players at you. My internet really isn't working so well anymore. It's kind of crapped out on me. So let's see if we can.
Yeah, you and me both. I'm running the own show, obviously, with the desktop studio, so I understand full well of internet and technical issues.
Yeah. So have it in front of me now. So in 14 games for the Colorado Avalanche, since coming over from Harvard University last year, Alexander Kerfoot has 5 goals, 4 assists, 9 points, and is a +3 so far on the year. So pretty decent stats from a guy who was really a bubble to a long distance shot to make the roster for this Colorado Avalanche team. So if I had a long-winded answer to your question, but Alexander Kerfoot is the guy that will benefit the most from the Matt Duchene trade.
All right. Well, as I did on Tuesday, I did a commercial-free, or should I say bed-free podcast with no breaks. So we're going to do that today. So we're going to just talk all sports all the time.
I'm up for it.
You up for it?
Up for it. Let's do it.
All right. So we're gonna let's go into the MLB awards briefly. I talked a little bit about it with the with some of the guys that were on Tuesday. Obviously, there was a sense out there that the Colorado Rockies were snubbed, and I, obviously am biased to the team. Just because it is that team, much like the Cubs are your team, Rockies are my team. But I think overall, really for me, this isn't really a slight to Joey Votto really getting in, because I know that Joey Votto is a tremendous player. But it's just like, for me, when you look at the whole award system and when you see just 2 of the 3 people that are up for the National League MVP award that never made the postseason.
Right.
And then you have Charlie Blackmon and Nolan Arenado. Both would have been deserving, either candidate. And frankly, you could have chosen either candidate. And people probably wouldn't be upset.
Right.
But I think the reason why people are so up in arms is because they went for Joey Votto. And while I think from what I've seen is that Votto did have very impressive on-base percentage, more so than Charlie Blackmon. But there still goes to that adage of making the postseason and putting up the type of overall numbers that Charlie Blackmon did from the leadoff spot. So, but I want to get your sense, certainly, of potentially the MVP race in the National League, and then we'll get into the American League MVP.
Okay, so I'm going to go in a little bit of a, I guess, different direction, and say that I fully support Joey Votto being there. I think I mentioned you on Twitter. I have no problem giving the MVP to a guy who is getting on base almost 46% of the time. You know, it's not like he has a 420 on base percentage. He has a 454 on base percentage. He drove in 100 runs on a really, really bad Cincinnati Reds team. You're talking really bad Cincinnati Reds team. And it's not just the on base percentage. He also hit 36 bombs as well. For me, for the finalists, my National League MVP is going to be Juan Carlos Stanton. And I'll tell you why it goes beyond his 59 bombs, which is equally as impressive as his 132 RBI total. But he also, to go with those power numbers, hit 281 and had a 376 on-base percentage.
Yeah, that's really good.
Which is close to being elite. You know, you have a guy hit almost 60 bombs, but he also gets on base almost 38% of the time. You know, his OPS is over 1,000 with a 631 slugging. You know, if you're into the more advanced stats, his weighted runs created 156, which I think is best of almost anyone in the National League. I think Joey Votto, according to Fangraphs, I have the leaderboard in front of me, had a higher weighted runs created than Juan Carlos Stanton. But if you look at the outlook of the Miami Marlins season, their team wasn't very good either, and they were struggling around the All-Star break. And if I remember correctly, and you would probably comment on it as well as a Rockies fan, but the Marlins were within shouting distance of the Colorado Rockies.
They were.
Until about early to mid-September. They were right on the heels of the Colorado Rockies. And the main reason that they were even contenders, even, you know, within thought of the National League wildcard spot, would have to be Juan Carlos Stanton. Without him, I don't think they would have done much of anything. So that's why I think, as far as the finalists go, I would have to give it to Juan Carlos Stanton. But as far as snub goes, I think Charlie Blackmon absolutely got snubbed, and I would take him in a heartbeat over Paul Goldschmidt.
Why Paul? I was going to say, why Paul Goldschmidt? Because, you know, Paul Goldschmidt is a player that, in my honest opinion, you know, for the longest time I felt that Jose Altuve was that player that was a very underappreciated superstar. And now he's taken it to a whole other level, and the Astros just won the World Series, and the team in general could be really good for years to come, much like the Chicago Cubs.
Absolutely. Same. Diamondbacks, Rockies, they're all going to be good for quite some time as long as they can keep their superstars under contract, which might be easier said than done for some small market teams like the Rockies and the Diamondbacks. And believe me when I say that I'm happy Paul Goldschmidt is a finalist for NL MVP, and I think that only bodes well for players like Blackmon and Nolan Arenado moving forward, because Goldschmidt for a while has been, you know, that guy that a lot of Diamondbacks fans have thought, hey, this guy's getting overlooked. Even national columnists, hey, this guy's getting overlooked for MVP. He's not really in the talk. He's not really in the consideration. And I think for the first time this year, you saw guys like Nolan Arenado, Charlie Blackmon getting more and more and more national recognition for, hey, maybe this guy should be MVP. So I think it's only going to bode well for the Rockies superstars moving forwards that Paul Goldschmidt is a National League MVP finalist. Now I'm going to tell you why I think that Charlie Blackmon should be in there instead of Paul Goldschmidt. As far as WAR goes, according to Fangraphs, Paul Goldschmidt 16th in the entire league as far as WAR goes. Charlie Blackmon is 9, but if you kind of look at their stats, really they were close to the same player. Charlie Blackmon hit 37 bombs out of the leadoff spot. Paul Goldschmidt hit 36. Charlie Blackmon had a lower K percentage than Paul Goldschmidt did. He only struck out 18% of the time. Paul Goldschmidt struck out 22. But Charlie Blackmon didn't walk a lot. But, that's not, he's still getting on base. He finished the year with a 399 on base percentage. Paul Goldschmidt with a 404. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Blackmon's weighted runs created at 141 and Goldschmidt's at 142. We talked about overall defensive rating as well. Paul Goldschmidt was a negative 7.6, but if you look at kind of, I guess, advanced statistics, they seem to undervalue first baseman because first baseman is kind of, I guess, deemed one of the easier defensive positions to play in the game. You can throw out a replacement level first baseman and he'll play closer to what Paul Goldschmidt is putting out defensively than if you threw out a replacement level center fielder. But Charlie Blackmon was a positive 1.7 defensive, and I think I mentioned it to you on Twitter, but the stat that stands out to me is Coors Field is the hardest, and I think you can back me up here,
Mm-hmm.
the hardest center field position to play in all of Major League Baseball.
Well, I was going to say it isn't just one of the hardest center field ballparks. It's actually one of the hardest outfield ballparks in general. Because here's the thing. What I was going to say is we understand about a hitter's ballpark, but here's the thing about Coors Field and why that whole hitter's narrative is completely asinine. It's because it really isn't the home runs that kill you at Coors Field.
Mm-hmm.
It's the doubles, it's the triples.
Right,
It's that left center at Coors Field that's going to basically give Charlie Blackmon or a Dexter Fowler or or a Billy Hamilton, those speedy players that are going to rack up so many triples. That was another area for Charlie Blackmon that was up there. I think he was leading the National League or leading the majors rather in triples. Now, so I think that I definitely agree with you as far as that narrative. The one thing that I think as far as another reason for me that I would maybe even take it to the level of a Joey Votto and maybe replacing Blackmon for either Paul Goldschmidt or Joey Votto, and that is the fact that it's a leadoff hitter, not a three-hole hitter who is with 100% certainty supposed to drive in 40 home runs or hit 40 home runs and drive in 100. Those players are expected to put up those types of numbers. Obviously, the leadoff hitter has been changing for the past 3 or 4 years, or really, actually, take it back, for about the last 10 years. The leadoff hitter has been changing for the last 10 years. But now you're starting to see players like a Mike Trout have so much success in the leadoff spot. You're having guys like George Springer having so much success out of the leadoff spot, who's also versatile enough that can bat third in the lineup. And then the point that I brought on Tuesday, which is maybe kind of a under-the-radar point, and you can comment on this also, but Bud Black was nominated for Manager of the Year. So you mean to tell me that you can't honor the players that he coached, and put them also in the awards, talking about either Nolan Arenado or Charlie Blackmon. See, that to me, I don't know. That kind of even also rubbed me the wrong way.
So I'm gonna backtrack to the beginning part of
what I was talking about.
Yeah, and this is why I would take Goldschmidt out instead of Votto and put Charlie Blackmon in there. Is I was actually having a conversation with my brother. Is I think Joey Votto was a better player this year than Paul Goldschmidt, and that's basically what I'm just basing this off of. I think if you switched out Paul Goldschmidt and Joey Votto, I think the Diamondbacks would be a better team with Joey Votto. But you look at the premier, I guess, first baseman, and a lot of them hit out of the 3-hole now. A lot of them hit out of the 3-hole now, Cam. You have Joey Votto, Paul Goldschmidt, Freddie Freeman, Eric Hosmer, Jose Abreu, Anthony Rizzo, Ryan Zimmerman.
Yeah.
All those guys are just big power bats out of, the first base position. Yeah, you expect them to get on base, but you also expect them to whack some balls. And that's his defensive position, and his position in the lineup is where I think Charlie Blackmon stands out. Yes, we can talk all day about his splits, about how he did versus home and away.
But even then,
well, his splits are, there's no denying that his splits are very lopsided, one-sided. So,
well, I was just going to say, go ahead.
His away splits, he hit 276. That's not a terrible batting average. It's actually pretty freaking good batting average.
Right.
He still hit 13 home runs on the road in 340 at-bats. He had 94 hits on the road as opposed to 119 at home. It's not like the guy's a scrub at, away from Coors Field. He still put up good numbers. Maybe not MVP numbers, but good numbers. And then when he was at home, he took advantage. And I think that Charlie Blackmon put up the kind of numbers this year that I thought would beat the whole, this guy shouldn't be MVP because of Coors Field. Because, he did this much at Coors Field. But he did so much at Coors Field that you could argue that he would be a good player at home in any other ballpark, even if it wasn't Coors Field. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. The amount of impact that he made in other areas. You talked about it earlier as far as his defensive metrics. And it was actually Facebook that you mentioned it to me. Because we stalk each other on Facebook, and we are friends on Facebook. Anyway, but yeah, so basically what it was is that you mentioned that he actually had, of the Colorado Rockies in Major League history, you said that I can't remember the exact sentence exactly, but I think you mentioned that. I was going to say that. Go ahead.
Two positive defensive players that play that center field. We mentioned earlier in the show how hard that center field position is to play, right? So the two players that have positive defensive ratings at Coors Field, there's two qualified center fielders. Charlie Blackmon's one of them. The other one is Dexter Fowler. And you know that I love Dexter Fowler.
Mm-hmm.
But he never did anything close with his bat when he played for the Colorado Rockies, or pretty much any time in his career that Charlie Blackmon did this year. And I think a stronger case could be made, and I know that, Nolan Arenado is the face of the Colorado Rockies, but I would argue that Charlie Blackmon doing what he did out of the leadoff spot was far more valuable to the Colorado Rockies, and he was more of a reason they made the playoffs this year than what Nolan Arenado did for the Colorado Rockies.
Yeah, and really, I'm not going to agree or disagree with you on that one, because it's in essence, it really was the Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo dilemma, last year, where Chris Bryant was an MVP candidate, Anthony Rizzo was an MVP candidate. You could go right with either one.
Yeah.
Really,
But then Chris Bryant kind of turned it on that last month and a half, 2 months, that really put him far and away and above an MVP candidate from not only Anthony Rizzo, but I think the rest of the field as well. as to why he won the unanimous MVP. And I don't think you had Charlie Blackmon pull away from Nolan Arenado as much as Chris Bryant did.
No, I think the difference. I was going to say,
know?
yeah, no, I agree with you there, because I think the difference necessarily between those two, between Nolan and Charlie, it was just maybe the case where they started seeing each other play exceptionally well, and they wanted to keep each other as far as on that same level of play throughout that year, that they wanted to try and top each other every single chance they got. And obviously never resulted in anything. It never resulted in an MVP nominee. But, really the opportunity, certainly maybe it could present itself in the future. It is ironic that the Rockies' overall season was literally flipped from last year. They finished with a record of 75-87 and last season, and then you look at this year, they're 87-75. But it's so funny, and we can just talk about the Rockies here briefly, or wrap up the Rockies, and we'll go into some football talk and talk about the disgusting Denver Broncos. But so the Colorado Rockies, I kind of compared them in essence to what the Houston Astros were a few years ago. You think back to 2 years ago, the Houston Astros took the league by storm, made the postseason, laid an egg. Following year, they laid an overall egg in the season and missed the postseason. The following year, this year, they come together, they formulate with their young nucleus, they form a terrific starting lineup, top to bottom, and then they started gelling with a pitching staff as far as Dallas Keuchel, Colin McHugh, Lance McCullers Jr., getting a Justin Verlander to really set themselves on, put themselves up over the edge, with maybe a little bit of shaky bullpen, but it did pick up late in the postseason. But really, as far as a team that you should maybe compare to, as far as with this young team, I can say that maybe the Rockies right now, and it's easy to say that now because they were bounced early in the playoffs and they had an 87-75 record. But really, it does bode very well as far as maybe comparing a Astros team of 2 years ago to the Rockies team of 2017.
I agree, and for me, I'm kind of worried about the Colorado Rockies' future, and that's entirely because you look at the pieces that they have now, right? Charlie Blackmon's contract is going to be up, and he'll be wise to command whatever money he can on the free agent market. And then you got to sign Nolan Arenado, what, in a couple years? I think? Or is it after next year?
I want to say it's a few years from now.
I think he goes to arbitration off the top of my head. I think. So you got to sign those two guys first and foremost. You got to lock you got to lock Chuck and you got to lock Nado up long term if the Colorado Rockies are going to have any sort of success. Okay, you have that young rotation, which is really, really good. But my main concern is, do they have enough money to sign Arenado and Blackmon and then also build around them? And that's why I absolutely hated the Ian Desmond deal this offseason. And I don't know how you feel about that, because I would love to see the Rockies go out this offseason and sign a guy like Eric Hosmer to bat cleanup or in the third spot for them and play first baseman. You know, a spot that they've sorely been lacking in since the departure of the Todd father, you know?
The original Todd father.
They just have too much money locked up in Ian Desmond, you know?
Well, and
I don't think that last offseason was really the offseason for the Rockies to go out and make a lucrative deal for Ian Desmond, you know? Because it didn't make sense heading into that, because you still have the opportunity for some guys to play first. And really, Ian Desmond wasn't their mainstay at first base. It was Mark Reynolds last year. But who could have predicted that? But still, you have prospects like David Dahl coming up. Really excited about him. Trevor Story. Hara had a really good year. So they have all these young pieces, but if they're not able to keep the elite talent they have on now, then I think the Rockies are in trouble, and I think that Ian Desmond deal might come back to haunt them, because you can compare them to the Houston Astros. The Astros are kind of a small market team, but I think the Rockies are a little bit more of a smaller team than the Houston Astros are even at that point.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
Maybe it's kind of twofold. Maybe it's the Houston Astros of 2 years ago, and then the Tampa Bay Rays team that were successful for a period of time for 4 or 5 years. I think it was the Tampa Bay Rays that played the Philadelphia Phillies in the World Series the year after the Rockies made it, and then the Rays were so successful with Joe Madden for, I want to say, 4 or 5 years, and then they tailed off. I'm not saying that the Rockies are going to tail off, maybe I am, but I think you're going to. I just, as far as the Ian Desmond thing, and as far as maybe looking at a first baseman, the Rockies are in a very precarious spot right now. Because Mark Reynolds put up terrific numbers last season for a guy that signed a 1-year deal.
But I don't think he'll put up numbers like that.
Right. What's impressive about Mark Reynolds now versus what Mark Reynolds used to do in his career was he was a strikeout machine. I mean, really, he's still striking out a bunch, but he's making himself a much better hitter and waiting on pitches and then exposing the best pitch possible for him. Now, and I think that it really benefited the Rockies, and as far as the injuries to Ian Desmond, because now it afforded them to give the reins to Mark Reynolds, who is a fairly decent first baseman. But then you obviously spend so much money on Ian Desmond, the 5-year, $70 million contract. That, in essence, is why I'm a little hesitant. I understand your point of view as far as maybe going out there and getting like an Eric Hosmer or a player like that. I understand it, and I would agree with that sentiment. My only issue is you have 5 years and $70 million locked up to Ian Desmond, and that's going to hamstring you for making a potential first base move in the long run. Now, however, history has shown, as far as the Rockies is concerned, a player will have a bounce-back year the following year, no matter who it is. So Ian Desmond could be in line to have a bounce-back recovery year, because he's certainly athletic enough to play first base. He's clearly shown that. But I think the more time he can spend there, and the more time he doesn't have to act like Scott Hatterberg, then I think the better he'll be at first base. But I think as far as the moves that they do need to make, this is interesting. I don't know if you saw the report out. It's a very smart move because of the bullpen. But it was reported by John Heyman that the Rockies are expected to push for a long-term deal with Greg Holland. I like the move overall, and it is worth pointing out he just ran out of gas, in my opinion. He just ran out of gas. It had nothing.
Well, you talk about a guy that's coming back from a major pitching surgery, and then you have him carry the workload on the back end of your bullpen. I mean, Greg Holland pitched X amount of innings coming off of major elbow surgery to the point where he missed an entire year, and not a lot of Major League Baseball teams wanted to take a flyer on him, and the Rockies really loaded his workload up quite a bit, and I think you're right. I think it caught up to him, but I think a full off season of just back to regular work for Greg Holland is going to work wonders for him.
but I think the under the radar point. And by the way, the rumor is swirling that the Cubs are interested in him.
I
But
wouldn't be surprised because it's unsure if they're going to be able to sign Wade Davis. And even if they do sign Wade Davis, 1-2 punch for the Cubs with Davis and Holland at the back end of that bullpen is going to help the Cubs greatly, especially, you can make the argument that their bullpen was the reason that they got bounced from the playoffs. I think the Cubs just ran out of quality pitching, you know?
Well, and for the Cubs' sake, and I don't know if the Cubs are going to end up with him or not, or the Rockies are going to end up with him or not, but the Cubs at least have the argument that they've proven, and who knows if they'll sign Wade Davis. This will prove it if they decide to cut ties with Wade Davis. But the Cubs have at least shown the propensity to have a rolling door as far as closers. They obviously kicked to the curb Aroldis Chapman. Probably one of the worst decisions, at least for the Cubs, because you certainly would have loved to have Aroldis back at least this year, as far as to at least have some stability.
Yes and no. Aroldis Chapman kind of had a down year. Did he not?
He was kind of up and down, but that's kind of what you get with a guy like that that's going to throw 150 miles an hour from the left side.
Right.
But now, as far as Holland, and going back to Holland, the point that I think that is so under their radar with Greg Holland, and it's a point that I put on Twitter, I don't know if you saw it, he has pitched his entire career with Steve Foster.
I think I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, it's just such an under the radar point that I don't think many people understand. It's that he is so comfortable pitching with Steve Foster. Why damage that relationship?
Right.
And why leave for something that is going to be just a change of scenery, change of pitching staff, and when you've dealt with Tommy John surgery, which is the equivalent to an ACL injury, although an ACL is probably or Tommy John's way worse, but as far as length of time can be a little sporadic at times for a Tommy John, to the point where it equals an ACL. That's a different point.
Yeah.
But as far as just everything in general with Greg Holland, Steve Foster understands the ins and outs to make Greg Holland a better pitcher. We saw how effective his slider was at halfway point of the season. It was to the point where he was the best closer in the game next to Kenley Jansen with the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Right.
He is an effective pitcher when he has that splitter/slider working. And when that is effective, there is nobody that can touch Greg Holland. And as much as who was the guy that won Comeback Player of the Year? Ryan Zimmerman. As much as Ryan Zimmerman probably should have been up for Comeback Player of the Year, I would argue that Greg Holland is the sole reason why the Rockies made the playoffs that they did, because for the longest time, hitting has always been the answer. It's just been the one-run games, winning in one-run games, and Greg Holland was a big proponent of that.
Last year they were in a ton of games, too, that their bullpen just lost it in the 7th, 8th, and 9th inning. It got to the point where it was painful to watch Carlos Estevez coming out of the bullpen, He came out and you knew the Rockies were going to lose, He provided that stability. So, yeah, I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, and I think Carlos Estevez, he has tremendous stuff. He has electric stuff. It's just about him trying to kind of harness it a little bit and try and not be like a left-handed or right-handed version of Rex Brothers, really. Because Rex Brothers was a guy that would have been the future heir to the closer role. He just never harnessed it for a full 4 seasons, really. He had that ridiculous stretch where he was like 0.0 for half a season, and then it finally caved in for him. But really, the Rockies need that second and third stable guy in the back end of their bullpen. And I think that's why Adam Ottavino was so frustrating, because he was so effective on his delivery with his slider. No one could touch his slider. One could argue he may have had the best slider next to Chris Sale. As far as just a slider is concerned. and the way that he comes off the mound. And so I just think that there's just so much there for the Rockies to get better at the bullpen that it's almost like pushing for a long-term deal for Greg Holland. Whether he faltered and threw a bad pitch in the wild card game, you can argue that, but at the same time, you can also argue that he is the sole reason why they got to the playoffs, and it makes a ton of sense for the Rockies to push for this long-term deal. However, there is that under-the-radar move, and it's an under-the-radar move that I've been talking to you about, and that is, and whether that's the kind of tug on your chain about the Jake Arrieta, but it is that reliable starting pitcher, and a guy that really the Rockies do need to focus hard on, because of the fact that you do have a pretty decent rotation. A really decent rotation. You look at what Tyler Anderson did coming off the disabled list. He had a 2.1 ERA coming off the disabled list. John Gray probably didn't harness it as much as anybody, but he still played exceptionally well down the stretch. And then you look at Kyle Freeland, who did what no one can do at Coors Field, and pitch a 3.1 ERA, which is the equivalent to like a 2.5 ERA for a starting pitcher overall. And then you look at, say, a guy like German Marquez, who came in like a
who I think was maybe the Rockies' best pitcher down the stretch.
He came in like a heat-seeking missile that no one saw coming. And, you know, Jeff Hoffman certainly has a lot of promise, except he...
will be dirty if he can take the offseason and develop, another pitch or two, maybe mix in, because all he throws is a fastball and a curveball?
Yeah, and the fastball and the curveball, but that curveball is pretty deadly. But
it's deadly, but if he can go in and develop, a changeup and maybe a cut fastball or a slider that works, away from, the right-handed hitters, that's just going to make him that much better of a pitcher to keep hitters off balance.
Personally,
he'll be able to get more swings and misses, more walk knees off of that curveball.
Personally for me, and it's one of the reasons why I think Greg Holland is so effective at Coors Field, and it's the pitch of the splitter. If there is one pitch, maybe I guess the slider can be two, because clearly the curveball is starting to prove that it can be pretty effective at Coors Field as far as the amount of rotation that certainly a guy like a German Marquez can have, and a guy like a John Gray can have, and a Jeff Hoffman. If there's one pitch that maybe Jeff Hoffman can potentially harness and maybe look to use more, I say he should look into doing a splitter. You're talking about how he needs to work off of the left-handed hitters if they're in the box, so he can pitch it away from them and get them off balance, and it would be the same thing for right-handed hitters that he can throw on the left side of the plate to get them off balance. I think that it would only help his maturation process as a pitcher, because you don't want to be known as a bullpen arm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for a guy that you traded for as the centerpiece of a Troy Tulowitzki deal, which actually in the long run is boding very well for the Colorado Rockies.
Yeah, absolutely. And you knew that it would.
Absolutely. And then really the minute, and this is the last point before we go into the Broncos, but this was the one move that I knew automatically that Jeff Bridich was not a puppet of Dan O'Dowd. And the minute that he made the deal, whether he consumed Jose Reyes' contract or not, that's a whole different story. However, the fact that he traded Troy Tulowitzki is a bigger deal than any of those moves in general, because I don't think that Dan O'Dowd would have had the gall to trade a guy like a Troy Tulowitzki. Would have been great to see him retire as a Rocky, absolutely. But seeing the way that Matt Duchene has handled it, and I think that during the last year and a half, you could kind of sense that a little bit too with Troy Tulowitzki. But I mean,
similar situations, really.
really, yeah. As far as being traded mid-game, mid scenario, it was kind of the same scenario. However, Troy Tulowitzki didn't really bash the whole Colorado Rockies team in general until he really went to Toronto. That's the only case that would be a little bit different. Any final thoughts on the Rockies before we go to the start to talk about the Denver Broncos, so we could start venting a little bit on that season?
Man, I think we could talk Colorado Rockies all day. Let's just pop into some football. This will be my Twilight Zone area if we're gonna have one. the one area of conversation where you will 100% have the expertise over me this evening.
Yeah.
So hit me with it. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings?
I'm disappointed. I'm just disappointed. Overall, the team is so talented. The team is 3-5 right now, but as we saw in the case last year, the team is so talented for them to be 3-5 that maybe it is falling on the coaching staff. Maybe it is falling on a staff that doesn't understand, doesn't know how to handle the pressure of a first season. And is it possible that John Elway could pull the trigger on a first-year head coach? It's certainly possible. I mean, all options are available, knowing that he pulled the plug on John Fox after so many winning seasons, and then they lose to the Indianapolis Colts in the divisional game, and he gets canned immediately after that. So I think that there is a lot of options on the table. However, I think that this week certainly does bode well for them if they want to show up well. Not a lot of people is counting on them. In a sense, it could be a trap game for New England. We understand that New England plays terribly in the Mile High City, Tom Brady in general, and the defense is certainly still there. And especially with the poor performance that was on display against the Philadelphia Eagles, they want to respond exceptionally well against the New England Patriots, who they match up exceptionally well against.
Yeah.
So I just think that as far as for me, the minute that they play the New York Giants, I wrote an article for Predominantly Orange. You guys can go check it out. The title of it was "If It Ain't Broke, Don't Fix It." Well, the fact is they broke it. They decided that they didn't want to be a running football team anymore, and they decided that they wanted to throw it 30 to 40 times a game, which is not their identity. It's almost like Mike McCoy was seeing ghosts of Peyton Manning, and that he wanted to run his offense and pass the ball 40 times a game and try and will his team to victory by throwing the ball so many times. And that's just not going to get the job done with this team the way it's constructed. You have a running back in C.J. Anderson who is a good running back, but I don't know if he's going to be here next year. You certainly have a much better running back core than you ever did with Jamal Charles, who I don't even know, at this point, I don't know why he's on the football team anymore.
Yeah.
Because of the amount that he's being used. So there's just a lot of question marks as far as mainly on the offensive side of the ball. Why is it that there's like three different sides of the football that are struggling? The right tackle, the left guard, and center at sometimes. Why is it that? Huh?
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Give me a second here. I'll pull up that box score from that Giants game, and I wholeheartedly agree that that might have been the turning point on the Broncos season. Is they came in, they had a 0-win team, come into Denver and take a victory away really in convincing fashion. And so Trevor Siemian threw the ball 50 times. And Osweiler, because Siemian went out for a little bit with an injury, threw it 4 times as well. So they threw the ball 54 times, ran it 17 times. And if I remember correctly, they were down, 14 points at halftime. And then they just abandoned the run game. They just stopped running the football, which you talk about everything that you can throw on Trevor Siemian for the year. He just hasn't been good. He flat out just has not been good. He got worse and worse with every single game. But I don't think Trevor Siemian was set up for success because he's not the quarterback that's going to go out and win a game for you. There's not a lot of quarterbacks in the league that are just going to go out and win a game for you. Trevor Siemian doesn't have that ability, And to abandon the run when you're down just 2 touchdowns with an entire half to play is just bad coaching. It's just straight up bad coaching, and we've seen it more and more times in the last few weeks when the Broncos have gone down. It seems as though Vance Joseph and McCoy get a little pass happy,
Yeah, and it's frustrating because it's now getting to the point where you start to want to see everybody at quarterback.
Right.
And that includes Chad Kelly.
Yeah.
And I think
Who's
that...
on IR right now, right?
Right. But I'm just saying just in general.
Yeah.
And now, you start to hear which I think it's bad on the point of the coaching staff, but it's also bad as far as the player is concerned as well.
Right.
I don't know if you heard the comments that Vance Joseph made about Paxton Lynch this last week or the week before,
I didn't.
where he said that Paxton Lynch, it appears that he is not mentally and physically ready for game action. Well, first off, that's in essence on your guys' fault and also on Paxton Lynch's fault, because for Paxton's case, he was given every opportunity to win the game, to win the open competition. He didn't. Obviously, that's on Paxton Lynch. But it's also your guys' opportunity, and this, in essence, I guess, goes to the Gary Kubiak offense that was led last year as well. But you never gave him any opportunity to fulfill himself as a potential project, because it was already established that Paxton Lynch was a project. So ultimately, you should make the decision that a 2.5 starter at quarterback or a 2.5 game performer needs more game action. I mean, you go back and you look at the amount of production that he put forth at Memphis. It was the case where he got better with every single game action. It's kind of the difference between a visual learner or kind of like a visual learner in essence, to where you usually learn the best in game action, that kind of thing. And I think Paxton Lynch is that guy where he has to learn if he's been thrusted into a game. And I don't know if we're ever going to see that. Obviously, there's reports coming out that they may go back to Trevor Siemian. There's reports obviously coming out that they may go to Paxton Lynch. It would be really stupid and benign by the Denver Broncos coaching staff if they went back to Trevor Siemian. If they went to the New England, if they win against the New England Patriots and Brock plays horrible, maybe. But at the same time, if you lose against the New England Patriots and Brock continues to...
That's it.
Just give it over to Paxton Lynch, healthy or not. Give it over to him, and they call him Paxton Lynch the Pirate. Maybe see if he is a sinking ship and see if he is a bust, because it is the rare case where you don't want to label a guy a bust. And in my opinion, you can't label a guy a bust after 2.5 games. 2.5 games is like literally nothing in the National Football League. And I mean, you look at Johnny Manziel. Johnny Manziel was given more games at his disposal before he was labeled a bust. Same with Jamarcus Russell and all those quarterbacks that were, thrusted into the spotlight. But ultimately, I think it's a coaching problem right now. But at the same time, he also doesn't have the personnel, which is sad. Because at the same time, I think personnel could also fall on his other coaching staff. Because that was one of the things that was being raved about with Vance Joseph, was his ability to put together a staff.
Yeah.
And people were raving about it, on the surface. They hired Mike McCoy as their offensive coordinator. They hired Bill Musgrave as their quarterbacks coach. They hired Jeff Davidson to be the offensive line, coach. They hired Jeep Chris to be their tight ends head coach. Everything was shaping up to be a really good coaching staff, and it's not panning out. And I'm ignoring the fact that Joe Woods and the Wade Phillips dynamic, just because Wade Phillips left for better money. You can argue that maybe Elway should have paid him.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, money talks. And if you're not going to give the guy a contract, you're just going to have him walk out. And
But
Joe Woods,
it's not the defense that's the problem.
right? And that's
Broncos
just it.
right
It's
now,
not
you
the
know?
defense. Did they have maybe the worst game of the no-fly zone era? Absolutely, against the Philadelphia Eagles. But take into account that football team you played on Sunday.
Yeah.
That football team of the Philadelphia Eagles is a very,
They might
very
be
good
the best
football
team
team.
in the league,
I would say so. Defensively, offensively, Jim Schwartz finally has himself a team, and he can finally coach himself a defense. And there's an offensive-minded staff of Doug Peterson, who was formerly of Kansas City, that is making a dynamic offense around Carson Wentz and is truly making it a unbelievable offense as far as weapons and everything like that. So you're starting to see it all come to fruition, all because of the play of Carson Wentz. And I really do think that, and it is a quarterback-driven league, and that's unfortunately what we have to come down to. But really, they have to find themselves a quarterback. And I was doing myself scouting as far as quarterbacks last night. I'm going to do some more after this show is over with. But I was looking at Josh Rosen last night. I'm going to be looking at Sam Darnold tonight. Look at Lamar Jackson, certainly of Louisville. I don't know about you. We can kind of talk about it a little bit as far as the quarterback class, because I'm under the impression the Denver Broncos are going to be wanting a new quarterback, whether it's in free agency or in the draft. But right now, let's talk about the draft. I think, as far as quarterback class in general, I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's a lot of good quarterbacks in college football right now. And I think a lot of them are coming out of schools that are, I guess, big schools. There's not a lot of big SEC names. And that's kind of one way that, I'm throwing it back to the Bears a little bit here because I'm a Bears fan. But that's kind of Ryan Pace and his, big strategy. The biggest name as far as quarterback coming out of the draft last year was Deshaun Watson, right? So what does he do? He goes in and he drafts Mitchell Trubisky from North Carolina. And I'm not trying to say Mitch Trubisky's having a better season than Deshaun Watson was having.
No, but he's still playing really well.
But he has done really well, and he's looked every bit the part. And you talk about the addition of Tariq Cohen. Tariq Cohen didn't play for an Alabama or an LSU or...
He did play for Alabama and A&M, if I remember right.
Yeah, he played for some small school. I think he played for NC State off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
So there's talent to be had out there. Cam, we might have a first-round quarterback pick from Wyoming University in this next draft. So.
Yeah, the problem that I would have with a guy like that for Josh Allen is he's another project. And do the Broncos want to... Incredibly talented. I think Josh Rosen and Josh Allen are probably the two most dynamic quarterbacks that's of the class. But do the Broncos want to put themselves in another project scenario with a guy like Josh Allen? Which I think...
I don't think it's a quarterback project. I think the one question for Broncos Nation that no one really wants to ask themselves is it time for the Broncos to rebuild? Is their window closed now that Peyton Manning's gone? They had a couple good years afterwards. Is their window closed?
Well, I think
should they rebuild or should they tear down a little bit, retool a little bit, and go back in a couple of years? And how do you sell that to the veteran defensive players on the Denver Broncos?
Well,
if that's the route you want to take?
Well, I think that you certainly will see some moves happen in the offseason. I really do. Whether that is going to be an Aqib Talib trade, or which that actually would set off a lot of repercussions in the locker room.
I think so too.
But is it a move that has to be made? I don't know. See, that's where I'm kind of in the middle on that one. But as far as C.J. Anderson, that's a potential release because of what we saw with D'Angelo Henderson in the preseason. They like him. I think if we were talking about small schools, kind of like Tariq Cohen, if we're looking at a situation kind of like a D'Angelo Henderson, if he was playing for a bigger school, he would have been drafted in the second and third round. I mean, he was that good. So I really do think that if you look at the case for the Broncos, it's still kind of a gray area as far as do you want to rebuild or do you want to rebuild like one half, meaning like
retool
or like
retool the
retool,
offense.
which I mean that's what they were talking about before, and whether that is just taking and releasing C.J. Anderson or releasing Jamal Charles or releasing Matt Paradis, maybe releasing or restructuring, I should say, either Emmanuel Sanders or Demaryius Thomas. We know Emmanuel Sanders is potentially the mouthpiece of the offense, but that would be kind of like asking Aqib Talib if you want to take a pay cut. Do the Broncos want to find themselves of asking Emmanuel Sanders, a wide receiver diva, if he wants to take a pay cut? That would not go over well. So
No, either. But if you're the Broncos and you ask Emmanuel Sanders that, you have to be prepared for him to say no. And if he does say no, you have to be prepared to then move on from a player like Emmanuel Sanders or move on from a player like Demaryius Thomas. You know, because don't get me wrong, Sanders, Thomas, still premier receivers in the league, but what they had 2 years ago, what Demaryius Thomas had 2 years ago, is no longer there, you know?
Well, but at the same time, it would also be a very interesting thought process as far as where potentially are the Broncos as far as their direction. If they set their sights on a veteran quarterback, and that veteran quarterback is a guy like a Kirk Cousins, an Alex Smith, or a guy like an Eli Manning, or a Drew Brees, if it's a case like that, well, then you know for certainty that the Denver Broncos are retooling. They aren't rebuilding, and you know that that there will be probably some people moving on as far as C.J. Anderson and Virgil Green, Menelik Watson potentially also, and Donald Stevenson maybe, but really, I think that's really their best alternative, is that they have to maybe look into the draft a quarterback, whether it's in the third and late rounds, and sign a veteran quarterback. And frankly, I hate to hamstring you with talking about the Broncos, hamstring them, but if I'm the Denver Broncos, I would hate to do it because they just have not shown the propensity of not wanting to get into a bidding war. But man, I am doing all that I can, bidding in all sorts to get Kirk Cousins in a Denver Broncos uniform, no matter the amount of quarterback-driven teams that will need a quarterback in the offseason. Because there's going to be a lot. That's the issue. There's going to be a lot.
It's a quarterback-starved league right now, the NFL is. So the Broncos, if they want Kirk Cousins, they're going to have to throw a ton of money at him too. And then you got to ask yourself, you know, is it worth it for 2 more years of keeping the window open, you know? Or should you just rebuild and move on from what you have now? Which would be a tough sell to, like I said, not only the veteran players, but to the people of Denver and the Denver Broncos fans as well. You know, the Denver Broncos are a team that's expected to do well every single year, year in and year out, you know? It's a tough sell.
It is a tough sell. And it's one that's really a tough situation. And I think it's one that, frankly, the conversation as far as, is this going to keep Elway's job or not?
Yeah, I think so too. I think you're nearing the point where draft picks are starting to become either make it or break it type of players. You know, a guy like Paxton Lynch, for example. You can't miss on Paxton Lynch.
Which is why you have to start him.
Yeah, throw him in now. I'm with you. If they lose this week to New England, the rest of the season should be Paxton Lynch's. 100%. He's your first round pick, you know, see what he can do, throw him in. That's why, again, I'm throwing it back to the Bears, but Mitch Trubisky, you know, throw him in, see what he can do. That's why everyone was so upset about that pick.
Well, but they were. I was going to say.
Is a pick.
I was going to say they were upset for a different reason. I was going to say they were upset for a different reason.
Yeah.
Because I mean, they signed Josh McCown to a hefty contract in the offseason, and then they drafted Mitchell Trubisky with the number 1 pick.
Right.
But at the end of the day, they are looking like geniuses.
Yeah, but it's not even drafting him that high. It's giving away all those draft picks.
Right. All the draft capital.
All those potential players for one guy. That's a draft pick that you can't miss on. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with Paxton Lynch. Paxton Lynch was a draft pick that the Broncos couldn't miss on. And right now they've missed on him. So
yeah, they got to do something right. Well, Sean, thanks so much, man, for joining the show, and we will look forward to having you on here in the future. A lot of great insight, man.
Yeah, later, dude.
Hey, you have a good one, and are you calling some more games?
Yeah, tomorrow and Saturday.
Awesome.
If you guys want to tune in, it's going to be njcaatv.com, based out of Rochester this weekend, and you can find that app on Amazon Fire Stick, Apple TV, and the Roku as well, Roku TV. So
sounds like a blast, man. Well, Sean Tafoya, the legend, thank you very much, man, for joining the show, and we'll talk some more hockey, some more baseball, and we're gonna maybe sprinkle in some soccer if you ever come on. There's some soccer talk.
I'm interested. Some Premier League.
Right, exactly. All right, man. Hey, you have a good one, and thanks for joining the Cameron Parker Show.
Of course, appreciate it, man. Have a good night.
You too. That will do it, ladies and gentlemen, for this edition of the Cameron Parker Show. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of the Cameron Parker Show. It was very comprehensive. This was our longest show. We touched on the Colorado Avalanche. We touched on the Colorado Rockies. We touched on the Denver Broncos. We touched on, we didn't exactly touch on the Denver Nuggets just yet, but we did talk a lot about much of the Denver landscape, which is something this Cameron Parker Show does exceptionally well. Thank you guys very much, and make sure you follow the show handle at CP_show. Follow my personal Twitter account at Cameron Parker PO, and as well as like my Facebook page at Cameron Parker. It's a picture of me with headphones on. Please go free and like that Facebook page. And you guys have a blessed rest of your guys' night, and go Broncos, hoping for a Broncos victory on Sunday night.